Welcome to the first lecture of week 1 for PHI 101 Introduction to Philosophy. And right now we'll be doing the first section of the second lecture on the topic, the meaning of life. We'll be covering the article that you should have read by now by Thomas Nagel called Birth, Death, and the Meaning of Life. So to kind of get the gears going a little bit, so let's ask this question. So what did Tolstoy and Camus have in common with respect to how they approach the question of the meaning of life? And I think one answer to that question is that, well, they both thought that life could have cosmic purpose or transcendent meaning only if God exists. God exists. Of course, they came to kind of different conclusions about that question. Tolstoy thought that God did exist, and so that life, in fact, did have cosmic purpose or transcendent meaning, whereas Camus, being an atheist, believed God doesn't exist, and so there was no such thing as cosmic purpose or transcendent meaning. But they both shared that assumption that cosmic purpose required the existence of God. And so we can kind of categorize these positions, these views, as occurring within a supernatural framework. And for this lecture, this week, we'll look at some non-supernatural frameworks. So, and as I've kind of divided up the conceptual space here, we'll have the category of nihilism, which says meaning in life is not possible, irrespective of the question of whether God exists. This will be exemplified by Thomas Nagel. We'll look at what we might call a subjectivist account of the meaning of life, according to which meaning is a matter of the subjective attitudes we take towards our projects, our desires, our goals. This will be exemplified by Harry Frankfurt. And finally, we'll look at what we can call an objectivist account of meaning, according to which there are some objective, mind-independent standards of what constitutes meaning, and that such meaning is possible. And this will be exemplified by the position of Susan Wolf. Okay. So now we'll start with Nagel. So Nagel argues that life is absurd. And Nagel has a few different articles on his notion of absurdity and the question of the meaning of life. And I chose the article for you to read that I did because I particularly like the story that he introduces the article with. This is the story of the spider. So to just briefly summarize that, Nagel recounts his experience back in the day at Princeton. And he noticed that in the men's restroom in the philosophy department, there was a spider that was living in the urinal in that bathroom. And he kind of sees a spider, and he notices the spider lives kind of in the center of the drain, eating flies and other sorts of prey that get in there. And when the urinal is flushed, the spider kind of desperately tries to climb up the side of the urinal, but is unable to escape because of the overhanging edge. And he kind of notices this, being a reflective philosopher. He continues to think about this through fall term. The spider's still there. And by the time winter rolls around, he becomes really depressed about his encounters with this same spider in the bathroom of the philosophy department. And he decides that he's going to liberate this spider from this absurd fate that it has. And so he takes a paper towel, kind of drops it down to the bottom of the urinal. The spider grabs on, and he releases the spider onto the side of the tile floor. And the spider kind of drops off and doesn't move. And he pushes it, the spider still doesn't move. And he comes back the next day, and the spider is kind of shriveled up and is dead. And so that's the story of the spider. And Nagel tells us that this story illustrates the hazards of combining perspectives that are radically distinct. And that's kind of the theme of this article, Birth, Death, and the Meaning of Life, that there's a particular hazard that occurs, kind of clash that occurs between two competing perspectives. Okay, so here's Nagel's characterization of absurdity. This is drawn from a different article called The Absurd. This was in an article in Journal of Philosophy. And so he says, in ordinary life, a situation is absurd when it includes a conspicuous discrepancy between pretension or aspiration and reality. Someone gives a complicated speech in support of a motion that has already been passed. A notorious criminal is made president of a major philanthropic foundation. You declare your love over the telephone to record an announcement. Or my favorite, as you are being knighted, your pants fall down. Okay. So kind of the thing to notice with that quote is that absurdity for Nagel is a conflict between pretension or pretense and reality. And so this sort of tension is going to arise between 2 points of view, what Nagel calls a subjective point of view and the objective point of view. So one thing to note about these different perspectives or points of view is they're really points on a continuum. So the subjective point of view is kind of the point of view that we kind of unreflectively live life from. And the most subjective point of view is the point of view of a particular desire at a particular time. So focus on whatever desire it is that you have right now that feels the most strong. So it might be to close this lecture and head off and have lunch with your friend or something like that. I have that desire right now. And we can kind of zoom out. Rather than looking at just one desire, we can take more of our desires into account. Maybe we take all of our desires at a given time into account. Or maybe over a duration, we take all of our desires and interests and goals over a lifetime into account. And from that perspective, my desire to go get lunch begins to look a little bit less significant than it did from that most subjective perspective. And of course, we can broaden the circle even more widely. We can take into account not just my own desires or interests or goals, but yours, our families, our friends, our fellow countrymen, our fellow earthlings, fellow human beings. And we can keep zooming out. And notice this, as we zoom more and more out, taking more and more desires and interests into account, that initial desire that I drew attention to initially begins to look much, much less significant. So at the very end of the continuum, the most objective perspective, the most objective point of view, what Henry Sidgwick called the point of view of the universe, we have the perspective that takes all interests and desires of all sentient beings at all times into account. So that's a whole lot of desires and interests. And from that perspective, your desire to go get lunch right now doesn't seem all that important. It's just a drop in a drop in a drop in a bucket of interests and desires. Okay. So here's Nagel's thesis, more or less. The problem of the meaning of life arises because these two perspectives, the subjective point of view and the objective point of view, they conflict. And the sense of the absurd arises from juxtaposing these two perspectives. Okay. So here's how things look from the subjective point of view. So for one, my birth seems necessary. My existence seems like a precondition of anything. It just seems necessary that I exist. My experience with the world, or my knowledge of the world, is always mediated by my experience of the world. And so it's easy to think that I myself am a necessary part of the world. Secondly, my life seems really important. I certainly pursue my own interests and projects with kind of vigor and a sense of enthusiasm that seems to reflect a belief that these sorts of things are worth pursuing with that enthusiasm, with that vigor. So I think that my life is important from this point of view. And furthermore, death seems really, really bad. Death seems catastrophic, seems like the worst thing imaginable from the subjective point of view. And so this perspective, the subjective point of view, is characterized by a sense of deep engagement with our interests and our desires and our goals and our projects. Okay. Now this contrasts starkly with how things look from the objective point of view. From the objective point of view, my birth is accidental. It's just not the sense in which, your parents, even if your parents planned to get pregnant with you, your birth was still accidental in the sense that it was radically contingent. I'll explain what that means in a little bit. Secondly, my life seems pointless and my death insignificant. So this perspective is characterized by a sense of detachment. When we take up the objective point of view, it's hard to kind of pursue those interests and desires and goals that we have with that same sense of enthusiasm, because they just don't seem that important from this perspective. And for Nagel, the conflict between these two perspectives gives rise to the absurd, which just is for him, the problem of the meaning of life. So here's an example of kind of how this detachment can work. So I write, I like to think, and I write a lot, and I read a lot, and I work really hard on writing, publishing a paper, and I'm totally invested. I get that final acceptance letter, and I'm like elated, like very, very happy, as my wife will tell you. But then the objective point of view creeps in, and I think, what am I doing with my life? I mean, I spent so much time working on this paper, but who's going to read it? Right? At best, probably 50 or 100 people read this paper. Then what? Maybe I'll get a citation. Maybe somebody will write a response in which they attempt to show why I'm completely wrong and stupid and crazy for holding this view that I hold. And then what? Right? Eventually, it will be forgotten. Eventually, the sun will explode. and any lasting impact will be erased. And it's hard to kind of treat my projects with that sense of significance once we let this objective point of view creep in. Okay, and to illustrate this, I'd like to visit a website right now. So this is a website that illustrates the relative scale of different items in the universe. So here you can see we have human beings. They're about similar size to the dodo bird. So reflect now on one desire that you have strongly right now. Maybe it's to go to lunch. Then we can kind of zoom out. We can see that compared to a redwood tree, we are pretty small compared to the Statue of Liberty, compared to Half Dome. And we can zoom out even further to the point of view of the celestial bodies. From this point of view, it seems like that desire that you have to go to lunch is not very important at all. Whether it's fulfilled or frustrated, it doesn't seem to make a really big difference. And we can go out even further, right? There's Earth, but Earth is tiny. It's tiny compared to the sun. And the sun is tiny compared to, I like this one, the Homunculus Nebula, which in turn is tiny compared to the Eskimo Nebula, and so on. And eventually we reach the limits of the observable universe, which itself is just a small part of the estimated size of the universe. From this perspective, it's really hard to take seriously the idea that your desire to go get lunch right now is very significant, is very important. And of course, we can go the other way too. There's a whole world kind of beneath ourselves on a much smaller scale. I encourage you to play around with this website. And if you go small enough, you'll eventually reach the building blocks, the quantum foam. So I encourage you to play around with that website, and we'll return to the lecture right now. Okay. So here's kind of further illustrations of this clash between these different perspectives, the subjective point of view and the objective point of view. So there's two objective facts about our birth that are difficult to reconcile with the way we experience the world. First, there's the radical contingency of our birth. So one of the things that Nagel notes in the article is that it was astronomically unlikely that you would come to exist just a moment before you were conceived, right? In order for you to exist, it requires existence of a particular biological organism. In order for that biological organism to exist, it requires existence, or requires the union of a particular sperm and a particular egg. And so there was a lot of sperm going on, swimming around in that situation just before the point at which you were conceived. So it was extraordinarily unlikely that you would come to exist. Now, I've been doing a little bit of reading about sperm and the odds of our existence. So think about 250 years ago. Here's an extremely, extremely optimistic estimation of the chances that you would come to exist just 250 years ago. Here's the odds. It's 1 divided by 6, followed by 100 zeros. That's extraordinarily unlikely. I mean, think about that, reflect on that. And I think for some of us, it makes us uneasy almost. You get a sense of survival guilt, like, man, think of all the possible people that could have existed that didn't. You're just one of the lucky few, extreme few. Okay. Now, a second kind of objective fact about our birth that's difficult to reconcile with the subjective point of view is the fact that our lives make no difference. So this will likely strike you as absolutely shocking because growing up, you've been told time and time again by your teachers and your parents and your friends that you're special, you're unique, you are a beautiful snowflake. No, 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 no. The fact that you exist and that I exist makes almost no difference from, say, the point of view of the Homunculus Nebula. And so these facts are extremely difficult to kind of reconcile with how things look from the subjective point of view, where my existence doesn't seem contingent, it seems necessary, and my life seems like the most important thing imaginable to me. So it's this clash of perspectives that gives rise to the absurd for Nagel. Okay. So there's this conflict between these two different perspectives. And kind of as a logical exercise, it's worthwhile to think about what possible solutions could there be to resolving this conflict. And there's at least 3 possible solutions that we can consider. Right? So there's a conflict between how things look from the subjective perspective and how things look from the objective perspective. So one solution would be to make the subjective point of view fit how things look from the objective point of view. And so Nagel suggests that this is possibly the solution kind of recommended by certain religious traditions, say Buddhism, in which we kind of try and rid ourselves of any earthly desires and just purely take up a subjective perspective in order to achieve transcendence. Now, Nagel's response is basically that the cure in this case is worse than the disease, that this is a waste of a valuable capacity. And recall the story of the spider that Nagel opened up the article with. Another kind of theme, I think, from that story is that absurdity is not necessarily so bad, right? The spider was okay in that urinal. His life was absurd, but it was okay. So there should be limits to what sort of what lengths we can go to in order to resolve the conflict. A second possible solution that Nagel considers is that we should think that our lives have the objective importance we place on them from the subjective perspective. So this is the opposite of the first possible solution. With the second solution, we should make the objective point of view accord with the subjective point of view. So this would be to think that our lives are objectively as important as they look from the subjective perspective. But Nagel's response here is that that's just crazy. It's crazy to think that your life is as important as it looks from the subjective point of view. It's just implausible. And a kind of one way to realize this is that although I pursue my projects, my own goals and projects with a sense of enthusiasm, more so than I pursue your projects because they're yours, I really don't think that my projects are any more important than your projects. And so Nagel thinks it would just be crazy to think that, objectively speaking, our goals and projects are as important as they are represented from the subjective perspective. And so you can't get rid of the conflict entirely that way. And the third resolution that he considers is just to say that the conflict doesn't matter, that we can kind of ignore it. And he thinks there's kind of 2 reasons that we can't ignore the conflict. The first is that these are 2 perspectives from the same person. They are our perspectives. And at the end of the day, there's this need to kind of come to an all things considered judgment to resolve this conflict. But he thinks that's just not really possible. And secondly, the objective point of view typically has normative authority. So for Nagel, kind of ethical thought and systems arises from expanding the circle where you start from the subjective point of view and you begin to take more the interests of others into account. And so we typically think that the objective point of view kind of carries weight, that we should accord, or we should kind of live life as if the objective perspective is right. And so he thinks that this is not a good solution to the conflict. So he thinks that none of these solutions work and that the problem of the meaning of life is irresolvable. It's an essential kind of feature of the human condition. So is there any solution? Well, he thinks there's no permanent, complete, total solution to the problem of the meaning of life, to this sense of absurdity. But he does think there's kind of an appropriate response to this fact. He thinks that we should approach our lives with a sense of humility and irony. And he also says that artistic or aesthetic contemplation can offer a temporary solution. So here's a quote from him. He says, "One can simply look at a ketchup bottle and the question of significance from different standpoints will disappear." All right, here's a test for you. Look at that ketchup bottle. Has a question of significance from different standpoints totally disappeared? Maybe a little bit, but probably not. But I think that Nagel's onto something here. I think this can be illustrated with this scene from a film that you may have seen called American Beauty. And so we'll take a look at that scene right now.
You want to see the most beautiful thing I've ever filmed? one of those days where it's a minute away from snowing. And there's this electricity in the air. You can almost hear it, right? And this bag was just dancing with me. Like a little kid begging me to play with it. For 15 minutes. That's the day I realized that there was this entire life behind things. And this incredibly benevolent force that wanted me to know that there was no reason to be afraid. Ever. Video's a poor excuse, I know. But it helps me remember. I need to remember. Sometimes there's so much beauty in the world. I feel like I can't take it. And my heart is just going to cave in.
Okay, thank you for watching that scene. So I really liked that movie. That movie came out when I was in high school. And I was like, whoa, this is really deep. But I don't know what you make of that. Maybe you think it's a little bit silly. But there is a sense in which I think it's true that being completely engaged in an activity or being completely engaged by a particular object can kind of temporarily relieve this conflict. So I like to rock climb. And one of the things that I like about it is that when you are engaged in that activity, it requires such focus that I'm not thinking about any of my worries, any of my stresses. I'm not thinking about my place in the universe or anything like that. I'm just completely engaged by this activity. And like Nagel says, the conflict between different standpoints begins to disappear. But of course, it's just climbing rocks, literally. It's not an important thing. It doesn't represent itself as important, but it does, I think, offer a temporary relief to some of these issues that Nagel brings up. Okay, so here's a possible objection to Nagel's account. So that was Nagel's account. Here's a possible objection. So this is offered by Duncan Pritchard. This is an optional reading, which you can find on Blackboard. So Pritchard argues that, well, he makes a distinction between two kinds of claims. So epistemology has to do with knowledge or belief, and that can be contrasted with metaphysics, which has to do with existence or being. And so an epistemological claim will be a claim about belief or knowledge, what we can know, what we have reason to believe. Whereas a metaphysical claim will be a claim about how the world or universe actually is. And so Pritchard distinguishes between two claims. He says, here's an epistemological claim that we can pick out from Nagel's article. From the objective point of view, it's hard to see how our lives could exhibit meaning or value. And then there's a metaphysical claim, which is distinct. In fact, our lives do not exhibit objective meaning or value. And so what Pritchard argues is that Nagel has only argued for the epistemological claim. That's the only kind of support or evidence he's given. He's given us reasons to accept the epistemological claim, but his conclusion is the metaphysical claim. And so essentially there's a kind of fallacy in reasoning here, that the metaphysical claim hasn't been established. So that concludes the lecture. Thank you.